Well, kia ora people. I thought it was time I gave you a little video clip explaining the ECE Reform proposal for a new early years ministry. So I'm Mike Bedford, I'm the Executive Officer for ECE Reform, and I think that this is an incredibly exciting proposal that is absolutely right for its time, and I hope you find this presentation inspiring. I need to say that this is not just a bright idea. We are absolutely intent on bringing this through to government and getting this change in our nation for the benefit of our children. Now, of course, the immediate question that comes up as soon as you propose a new ministry particularly for early care and education in New Zealand, is what about all the effort that was made to bring childcare under the Ministry of Education back in 1990? And so I thought it might be good to give you a little bit of a history around that as to why that move was made. And at the time, it made sense. But as time has played out, I think you'll see that we've had some problems and it's time for a relook. Now, back in the 80s, if you were in full-day childcare, there was no guarantee that you could access any form of early childhood education. You couldn't attend kindergarten or play centre because you were in full-day care. Some providers ensured that children did receive early childhood education from trained teachers in private childcare, but there was no requirement to do so. So some children were going to be disadvantaged. And so the intent was not to call childcare early childhood education, but to make sure that every child in childcare received early childhood education. So we're putting early childhood education into childcare. Now, that's really important because I have come across sometimes from academics, people saying, you know, get with the times, people, we're not talking about childcare, we're talking about early childhood education, we're talking about early learning. No, we're not. Childcare is childcare, and we have to get the terminology right. So no one who has a good understanding of children's learning and development would propose putting children into a large group environment for their education longer than 4 hours a day at the maximum in early childhood, and that's for the oldest children. No one with a couple of brain cells to rub together is going to put their 1-year-old into group care for their education. The driver behind these things is childcare while parents go to work. And yes, through all of that time, children are learning, and through all of that time, they not only need trained teachers, but they need teachers who are trained in pediatrics. Particularly the younger you go, the more you're dealing with babies, the more you need that training and that whole person care. So it's essential that we call things what they are, because if you use the wrong language, you're not going to recognize reality, and so you're not going to deal with reality. And that's why we've ended up with this completely unreal scenario in inappropriate language of referring to children in their early years as early learners. No, they're not. They're children. Think about this one. So learning is essential to human development when you're very young. Eating is also essential to human development, but we don't refer to children as early eaters, do we? I don't think we should call them early learners either. Children are children, and they deserve quality of life during this time. Now, I'll just mention as a little bit of extra history that I came into the sector in the early 90s, shortly after the transition to the Ministry of Education. And I came to it from a public health angle. Over the period of the 90s, I visited several hundred early childhood centres, and I became inspired by early childhood education. In fact, I remember, saying to people, wow, wouldn't matter what my job was, this is a delight. I saw the potential. But I also observed that the health and well-being of children had been forgotten. And that was a pointer, it was an early warning. So I saw that ergonomics was being ignored, that children had rates of infections that were quite avoidable, and that teachers were not being given the training they needed to keep children healthy. So what had happened is that when the Ministry of Education took over childcare, They didn't want to be responsible for childcare, they wanted to be responsible for education. And so all of the focus went on education and what we're doing for children's education. In that context, I saw children in the youngest groups, babies and toddlers, in dismal conditions, and they weren't getting any attention from the Ministry of Education because that wasn't registering as education, even though children are learning like crazy at that age. So there was a misfit here. But the question I'd have to ask now is, where did our 30-year experiment take us to? And we at the moment have a situation where the sector is crashing, that we have a desperate shortage of teachers. And I know from talking to lots and lots of early childhood teachers that every single case of a teacher I spoke to had left the sector, it was not because of pay, even though I absolutely support better pay for teachers. It was the conditions that drove them out. And those conditions relate to a number of things. They relate to our very poor minimum regulations. They relate to commercialisation. I'm going to touch that on that a little bit later. But they also relate to the siloed function of government. So I want to, by the way, I'm just going to catch up on a little phrase there, an expression. I talked about commercialisation. That's distinct from private ownership. Some of the most beautiful places that I've been to are privately owned, places where I've said, oh, can I be free again? I just love this place. This is wonderful. It's not about that. Commercialisation is when children are just numbers on the balance sheet, and a business that's there to make money. Making money is the main goal, not the care of children. And that's one of the major shifts from the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, I know because I was so much involved with the sector that most people were involved because they wanted to do the best thing for children. That's where the passion was. And that started to drop away, particularly from the late 90s, coming into the millennium with what I would describe as a low quality growth-based model of just trying to get bigger and having more centres. So big change in the sector. So the 30-year experiment, where have we got to? Think about these questions. Are most children now enjoying environments supportive of their development? Are most children spending their hours during the week in environments that we would want to spend our time in, that we would think were really good, that we could imagine as a child wanting to be in? Are children arriving at school as confident, competent learners? Are they arriving with the competencies and the capabilities, the vocabulary, the self-management skills that we would want them to have at that point? Are teachers valued and respected by the Ministry of Education as teaching professionals? Are you respected as a voice to the ministry? Centre owners, are you respected as a voice to the ministry? Are ECE teachers connected to primary in an integrated system? Do we see an increasing number of high quality ECE and care environments? Are they getting better or are they getting worse? Have regulations improved? Ratios, spaces, group size? Is diversity supported? Play centre, kohanga, home-based, sessional ECE? And particularly for centre owners, if you're one of those people who are just, I know people just giving heart and soul as centre owners to do the best for children, do you feel supported to give the best quality? Do you feel protected from predatory commercial practice? Is the system working for quality for you? So think about these questions. I mentioned before the licensing system. Sorry, but I mentioned, yeah, I think I did mention the licensing system, but we're going to talk about that because if we roll back to the 80s and 90s, the licensing system was okay, but it was not designed to cope with commercialisation. So as soon as you bring in the idea that childcare is just business, the licensing system that we have doesn't work anymore. You end up with a system as it is now that is stacked with perverse incentives that motivate profit-based providers to run to the minimum standard because that's where the money is. And we end up in a situation where high-quality providers are commercially disadvantaged and may end up closing because of that. So we're gradually going downhill. One of the proposals from ECE Reform is quality-based contracting, and I'm going to talk about that in another video clip. But quality-based contracting changes that system, and it means that now the best quality providers are protected by the system and nurtured by the system, and poor quality providers are gradually removed. That the provision is no longer just a business right, it's actually a privilege to look after our most vulnerable citizens in society, and I believe that's the way it should be. But I won't go any further into that one, except to say that this is one of the major functions of the early years ministry, is to operate the quality-based contracting system. Now, going to the heart of the early years ministry, this would be set up under a piece of legislation called the Early Years Quality of Life, Care and Education Act. So at the heart of this is quality of life. Also at the heart of this is care for children and early education as a right for our children to be provided by society. So it pulls all that together in one holistic package. Now, I want to talk for a moment about quality of life, because I'd have to say this is not something I've heard the Ministry of Education talking about. And it's one of the problems of siloed government. That, you know, when you think about children spending long days in childcare, when you're really young, so let's say you're 3 years old, at breakfast time, dinner time is a long way away. And you're thinking about that. You're thinking about what are you doing now? You're thinking about what do I want to do? Am I happy? Am I worried? Do I need a hug? It's all about the moment now. That's early childhood. And your days are long. A week is too long to think about. So I would propose that those 5 years that children spend in early care and education quite often are equivalent to, the first 5 years of life would be equivalent to 10 to 15 years of midlife experientially, which is why you get to 5 years old and you feel like you've lived forever, because in a sense you've lived a very long time. Quality of life in those days is so important. And I'll just mention a little discussion that I had with a group of early childhood teachers. We looked at the question, let's say your child has just been born and very sadly, doctor comes to you and says, look, I hate to tell you this, but unfortunately your child has a condition. And very few children with this condition make it beyond the age of 5 years. What do you want for your child in those 5 years? You're not talking about getting ready for school or preparing to be a productive member of society. You're saying, this is the life you've got. What do you want in that time? And you know, the answers that we came up with are exactly the things that will set children up to be confident, competent learners, that will set them up to be able to take the best advantage of trained teachers, to come out strong, because happy, healthy children learn. That has to be the basis. You cannot have any level of quality early child education simply by putting trained teachers into appalling low quality environments. That is not okay. But that's what happens when you forget about care. And this is the problem, that when the Ministry of Education took over childcare, the siloed function of government meant that they didn't want to be talking, they didn't want to be responsible for childcare. They wanted to be responsible for education. And care got forgotten. Another aspect of, you know, siloed government, just a way to illustrate this is in 2001, I had a conversation with the then CEO of Early Childhood Development, which was a branch of the Ministry of Education. And this person said to me, well, you do health, we do education. I really don't see the connection. Astonishing. How could they not see that this is absolutely connected? And you know, the early childhood curriculum guidelines to whakike is not an educational model. It's a human development model. It's a model that you could use in business. It's a model you could use in a retirement facility. It's about the whole human being. Fantastic. But it's more than education. And that's why in the 90s, fairly early on in my own career in this, I found myself working with early childhood teachers on how to get wellbeing back in to the whakike, to weave it back in. Stop calling it health and safety, people. It's the whole thing of wellbeing. It's the whole person. So we had lost our way, I think, on quality of life. So when we look at the functioning of the early years ministry, it has two major parts to it. So the first part is to operate the quality-based contracting system for children in early care and education. And the other part is to connect across government. So this would be a department that is not only mandated, but required to foster and coordinate government connection for children in the 0 to 8 range, so extending that early years out now for this purpose. So that means that they will be talking to the Ministry of Education, talking to the Ministry of Health, making sure that there is connection for early childhood teachers with their colleagues in primary. In this ministry, by the way, under quality-based contracting, teachers would be an honoured and respected part of the workforce. So when people have said, well, would this mean that teachers are treated as childminders? No, no, they would be treated as the professional core of this ministry. But coming back to that cross-government function, so other government departments would be required to consult with the early years ministry on any policy that affected children in the early years. So that's part of that way that government is made to connect. They would also be talking to local authorities in the management of like Resource Management Act, resource consents, so that we don't have this shocking mishandling of resource consents that forces children into industrial and commercial zones, that favours people sticking childcare centres on busy main roads and next to roundabouts to the detriment of child health. That needs to stop. We need to make sure that we can bring children back into communities, into streets with trees and houses and parks. So that would be that connection across government, but we would also be talking about connection with Oranga Tamariki, with WINS. This would be a department that also would explore options to support parents to spend more time with their children and take advantage and reinstate sessional early childhood education, to support play centre, so that instead of, I mean, we have to provide funding into this area because of the disaster of house prices in New Zealand, but it makes sense to support parents to spend more time with their children rather than less. So this department would be tasked with exploring those options. How can we make that work? So altogether, this is aimed at building quality of life in the early years and giving children a much better platform going forward. So what would we like you to do now? Please go to www.ecereform.org, our website. That's where you'll find the discussion documents. That's where if you've got more questions about this, you'll find that in our library of discussion documents. And it also means that you can come in and join a discussion. So we want people to join as members of ECE Reform. ECE Reform is not a protest organisation. It's a systems-based solutions and advocacy organisation. And so we want people coming in, discussing it, and then getting to the point of supporting that to government. Now, when you join ECE Reform, there's a little form you fill in that gives details about where you sit in the sector in terms of occupation, or are you a parent, but your identity remains strictly confidential. So we don't put out the names of our members because we know that that could put some people at risk, unfortunately, in the sector, even though we're a totally positive organisation that still exists. So we would not divulge your information without your permission. Now, that means that when you get involved in discussions, you can use a pseudonym if you want to. When we put our recommendations to government, you can have your name on there supporting it if you want, or you can do it anonymously as part of our statistics of who provides the support. But I do hope that you have found this presentation inspiring, that you'll come and join the conversation. And so thank you so much for listening.